The soft, rhythmic thump of the polishing cloth against sterling silver was the only sound in the cavernous dining room. It was a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. Thump, wipe, turn. Thump, wipe, turn. I could do it in my sleep. The Takahashi crest, a stylized hawk in flight, gleamed under the recessed lighting, each feather a sliver of perfect, cold light. My reflection stared back from the curve of the serving platter, a woman in a simple, dark blue dress, a crisp white apron tied neatly at my waist, my hair pulled back so severely it felt like a helmet. Efficient. Invisible. That was the job. The house itself was a contradiction, a silent war between ancient tradition and brutalist modernity. Shoji screens slid open to reveal floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a sprawling Zen garden, where meticulously raked gravel sat beside a polished concrete water feature. It was a house that knew its own power, a place of quiet, immense, and terrifying wealth. And it all belonged to one man, Ryo Takahashi. I had only ever seen him in passing. A shadow in a tailored suit moving down a hallway. The low murmur of his voice from behind the closed doors of his study. The scent he left in his wake, a clean, sharp fragrance of cedar and something like cold smoke. He was an absence more than a presence, a center of gravity around which this entire silent, perfect world revolved. His wife, Akiko, was the opposite. She was all bright colors and loud laughter, filling the empty spaces with perfume and chatter. A beautiful, fragile doll living in a beautiful, dangerous box. Tonight, the doll was entertaining. A low laugh, not her own, drifted from the main sitting room. It was the third time this week. A man named Sato, some real estate developer with teeth too white, and a watch that screamed new money. He was everything Ryo Takahashi was not. Loud, obvious, soft. The grandfather clock in the foyer began its solemn chime.
10 o'clock.
Mr. Takahashi was not due back from Kyoto until tomorrow afternoon. I finished the last piece of silver, laying it carefully on the velvet-lined tray, my movements economical and silent. My shift was over. I could slip out the staff entrance, walk to the train station, and be back in my tiny apartment in Shinjuku, a world away from this cold perfection. I could forget the laugh I wasn't supposed to hear. That was the plan. But then I heard a different sound, a sound that did not belong. The whisper-quiet crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A car door opening and closing with a solid, expensive thud. My blood went cold. I froze, platter still in my hands. Through the sheer curtains of the dining room window, I saw the long, black silhouette of his car, a machine as sleek and predatory as its owner. He was home, early. My training, my instinct for self-preservation, screamed at me to disappear, fade into the woodwork. It was not my place, not my business. But as I turned toward the kitchens, another sound came from the sitting room. Akiko's voice, a breathless little giggle, followed by the distinct, wet sound of a kiss. My feet stopped moving. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. If he walked into the foyer from the main entrance, the sitting room doors were directly to his left. He would see. He would hear. And I, Lena, the invisible maid, had no idea what a man like Ryo Takahashi did when his world was betrayed inside his own home. But I knew it would not be quiet, and I would be the only witness. The heavy front door clicked open. I saw his shadow fall across the polished marble floor of the foyer.
Tall.
Impossibly still. He moved like the air itself parted for him. I had 1 second to make a choice. I put the silver tray down on the mahogany table without a sound. I stepped out of the dining room, my soft-soled shoes making no noise. He was shrugging out of his overcoat, his back to me. The suit he wore was a dark charcoal, tailored so precisely it looked like a second skin. He must have sensed me, the way a predator senses a change in the wind. He turned, not quickly, but with a deliberate, lethal grace. His eyes found mine. They were dark, not black, but a deep, fathomless brown. For the first time, I was seeing him up close, not as a shadow, but as a man. and the sheer, absolute authority in his gaze was enough to steal the breath from my lungs. There were faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a single, thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow.
He didn't speak.
He just watched me, his expression unreadable, waiting for me to explain my presence. Another giggle from the sitting room. His head tilted a fractional movement. His focus shifted toward the sound. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. I moved before I could think. I crossed the space between us in 3 silent steps and put my hand on the cold, expensive wool of his suit jacket. It was a shocking, forbidden act. Staff did not touch the family. Ever. His eyes snapped back to mine, and for a heartbeat, I saw something truly dangerous flicker in their depths. I thought he might break my wrist. "Stay silent," I whispered, my voice barely a thread of sound. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stared at me, at my dark hand on the sleeve of his pristine suit. I did not pull away. I held his gaze, trying to pour all of my urgency, all of my warning, into that single look. I tugged gently on his sleeve, pulling him back toward the shadows of the dining room entrance where we stood. He followed, his movements fluid, not a hint of resistance. He was curious. Or perhaps he simply wanted to see what the mouse would do before he crushed it. I pointed toward the sitting room doors, which were slightly ajar. I pressed a finger to my own lips, then backed away, melting into the deeper darkness near the wall. He moved to where I had been, a ghost in the dim light. He was utterly silent, a study in contained violence. He stood beside the door, not looking through the crack, but listening. "He'll be back tomorrow." Akiko's voice was clear, laced with a petulant whine. "You should go soon. Let him come." The man, Sato, slurred slightly. He sounded drunk on arrogance. "I'm not afraid of him." There was a rustle of silk. "You should be." A silence stretched, thick and heavy. I watched Ryo's profile. Nothing.
No anger, no sulk.
Just an unnerving, absolute stillness, as if he were carved from ice. He looked less like a man betrayed, and more like a general assessing a battlefield. Then, the sound of another kiss, longer this time. I watched Ryo's hand, which was hanging at his side. His fingers slowly, deliberately, curled into a fist. The movement was so controlled, so precise, it was more terrifying than any shout could ever be. The knuckles went white.
He did not look at them.
He had heard enough. He took a half-step back from the door, his movements still unnervingly silent. He turned his head, and his eyes found me in the darkness. The cold fury in them was a physical force. It promised retribution, swift and surgical. I felt my entire body clench, preparing for an impact that never came. He walked past me, back toward the foyer. I expected him to throw open the doors to the sitting room, to unleash the storm that was gathering behind his eyes. He did not. He picked up his overcoat, folded it neatly over his arm, and retrieved a briefcase I hadn't noticed before. He turned back to me, his face a mask of cold composure. "Wait for me in my study," he said. His voice was low, perfectly level, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable command. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not leave the room. Touch nothing." Then he turned and walked, not toward the sitting room, but down the long, dark hallway that led to the back of the mansion, toward the wing where his private security was housed. He moved without a sound, and then he was gone. I stood alone in the echoing silence, the sound of my own heart a frantic drum in my ears. I had seen the crack in the perfect facade. I had shown it to the hawk himself. And now, I was locked in the cage with him. The study was as silent as a tomb. It smelled of old paper, leather, and his cologne, that scent of cedar and smoke. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, my hands clasped tightly behind my back, feeling like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The room was a reflection of him. A massive mahogany desk, cleared of everything except a single, black laptop and a small, framed photograph face down. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes in Japanese and English. There was no clutter.
No weakness.
I obeyed his order. I touched nothing. I just waited. Each minute stretched into an eternity. The grandfather clock chimed 11, then the half hour. I heard no raised voices, no sounds of a struggle. The silence from the rest of the house was more unnerving than screaming would have been. It was the silence of absolute control. Finally, the door opened. Rio entered, closing it softly behind him. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp, white shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and covered in the intricate, flowing lines of a traditional tattoo that snaked up from his wrists. The ink was a dark, menacing blue, a river of dragons and clouds that disappeared under the fabric of his sleeve.
He didn't look at me.
He walked to the wet bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a heavy crystal glass. He downed it in one smooth motion, his throat working. He set the glass down with a quiet click. "They are gone," he said, his back still to me. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. I didn't know if gone meant sent away or something more permanent. I did not ask. "Your name," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "Lena," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He finally turned to face me. He leaned back against the bar, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement pulled the fabric of his shirt taut, and the sheer physical power he radiated was overwhelming in the enclosed space. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He said my name differently than anyone else ever had. It wasn't soft. It was sharp, deliberate, as if he were cataloging a new possession. "You have worked here for 6 months. You are from America. You are quiet. You do your job. You see everything and say nothing. Until tonight, he knew who I was. Of course he did. A man like him knew everything that happened under his roof." "Why?" he asked, his dark eyes boring into me. "Why show me? Your contract is with the house, not with me. Your loyalty is to the position, not the man. You could have walked away." I met his gaze. Lying to this man felt like a fatal mistake. "What I saw was a threat to this house," I said, choosing my words with care. "Sato is not just some developer. His family is a rival. What my employer's wife was doing was not just infidelity.
It was a weakness.
An opening. I did my job. I protected the house." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe respect, passed through his eyes before being extinguished. He pushed off the bar and walked slowly toward the desk. He picked up the face-down photograph, his thumb stroking the silver frame. "Weakness," he murmured, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the picture for a long moment, his expression unreadable but for a sudden, deep weariness that settled over him. "I built this empire to have no weaknesses. I chose a wife who was meant to be a fortress, not a crack in a wall." He set the photo down, still face down. He looked back at me. "You have now become a part of this. A witness. That makes you a liability."
My throat went dry.
I knew what happened to liabilities in his world. "You have 2 choices," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre. "I can give you a severance that will ensure you can disappear. Go back to America, start a new life, and never speak of this night to anyone. If you do, my reach is long. You will be found.
Or you stay.
Here, in this house. Not as a maid. You will be my personal assistant. You will be by my side. Where I can see you. Where my enemies can see you. They will know you are under my protection. And they will know that to touch you is to declare war on me." It wasn't a choice. The first option was a death sentence with a head start. The second was a prison sentence in a gilded cage. But in the cage, I would be near him, the source of the danger, and the only one who could protect me from it. He saw the calculation in my eyes. "To the world, you will be an employee. To my men, you will be untouchable. To me," he paused, his gaze intense, "you will be a reminder. A reminder of his failure, of the betrayal he never saw coming." I could have run. I could have taken the money and tried to vanish. But looking at him, at the profound isolation that surrounded him like a shroud, I saw a man encased in ice. And for some reason I couldn't explain, I wasn't afraid of the cold. "I'll need a new uniform," I said. The days that followed were a blur of tension and transition. I moved from the sparse staff quarters to a suite of rooms in the main wing of the house, a space larger than my entire apartment. My simple blue dress was replaced by a wardrobe of tailored black suits and silk blouses, clothes that felt like armor. I was no longer Lena the maid. I was Miss Lena, Mr. Takahashi's assistant. The staff, who once worked alongside me, now bowed their heads when I passed, their eyes filled with fear and curiosity. My life was now intrinsically tied to Ryo's. I managed his schedule, sat in on his meetings, a silent presence in a room of men who smelled of steel and ambition. I translated documents, my fluency in Japanese and English suddenly a valuable asset. I learned the language of his empire, not of words, but of silence, of glances held a fraction too long, of debts owed and threats delivered in the most polite of terms. Ryo was a constant, unnerving presence. He rarely spoke to me about anything other than work, but I felt his eyes on me constantly. When I poured his tea, when I handed him a file, when I stood by the door of his study, he watched me with a predatory stillness, as if trying to solve a puzzle. I was the anomaly in his perfectly calculated world, the variable he hadn't accounted for. One night, a week after the incident, the war that Akiko had invited into our lives arrived at the front door. I was in the study, organizing files, when the first sound hit, the sharp crack of shattering glass, followed by the percussive, ugly stutter of automatic gunfire. My blood ran cold. The security alarms blared, a piercing shriek that echoed through the house. Before I could even react, the study door flew open and Ryo was there. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket, just his white shirt and black trousers. In his hand was a pistol, held with a familiarity that was terrifying. "Down," he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. He didn't wait for me to obey. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand clamping around my arm, and pulled me down behind the massive mahogany desk. He shoved me against the wall, his body shielding mine. I was pressed between the cold wood and the solid heat of his chest. I could feel the thrum of his heart, steady and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic terror of my own. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and his cologne. "Stay here. Do not move," he whispered, his lips so close to my ear I could feel the warmth of his breath. He rose into a crouch, moving toward the door, as silent and deadly as a panther. The sounds of the fight were brutal but brief. Shouts in Japanese. More gunfire. Then, a sudden, ringing silence. I stayed where I was, my body trembling, my mind reeling. He had used his body to protect me. It was a tactical decision, I told myself. I was a witness, a liability he needed to control. That was all. After a few minutes that felt like a lifetime, he returned. There was a dark smudge of something on his cheek and a single, ugly gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly onto his white cuff. "It's over," he said, his voice tight. He re-engaged the safety on his pistol and set it on the desk. He looked at me, his eyes scanning me from head to toe, checking for injuries. His gaze lingered for a moment on my face. "Are you hurt?" "No," I managed to say, my voice shaky. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady. My eyes fell on the cut on his arm. "But you are." Without thinking, I went to the small wet bar and grabbed a clean cloth and the bottle of whiskey he favored. I returned to him, my professional instincts taking over. "Sit down." He looked surprised by my tone, but he did as I said, sinking into the leather chair behind his desk. I took his arm gently, my fingers brushing against the hot skin just below the wound. I poured the whiskey over the gash. He didn't so much as flinch, though I saw the muscles in his jaw clench. As I carefully blotted the wound, I noticed something. A small, almost faded scar on the back of his hand, near the knuckle. It was old, different from the fresh cut. "The first time I failed to protect someone, the wound was worse," he said, his voice quiet, rough. I froze, my fingers still on his arm. I didn't look up. "She was not like Akiko," he continued, speaking to the room, to the past. "She was not a fortress. She was a garden in the middle of a war zone. I thought I could keep the war out, but it found its way in. He paused. They used her to get to me, to create a weakness, an opening. He was using my own words. He was telling me about the face-down photograph on his desk. He was showing me his one true wound, the one that had nothing to do with the bleeding gash on his arm. I finished cleaning the cut and wrapped it tightly with a cloth. Our hands were close. His, large and scarred, stained with ink and violence. Mine, steady and competent. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I finally lifted my gaze to meet his. The coldness was gone from his eyes. In its place was something raw, something unguarded. It was the first time he had looked at me, and I felt like he was seeing me, Lena, not just the liability or the assistant. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken things. He was the most dangerous man I had ever met, a king in a realm of shadows and blood. But in that moment, all I could see was the profound, aching loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. He slowly reached out with his uninjured hand, and his fingers brushed a stray curl that had escaped my severe bun. The touch was featherlight, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through my entire body. It was the first moment of tenderness I had ever seen from him.
Small.
Almost deniable. "You are not a liability, Lena," he said, his voice a low murmur. His fingers dropped away. "You are a complication." The attack on the house changed everything. The war with the Sato clan was no longer a cold one fought in boardrooms and back alleys. It was hot, and it had breached the walls of Rio's fortress. And I was at the center of it. Rio's demeanor toward me shifted. The professional distance remained in front of his men, but in the quiet moments, in the sanctuary of his study, the space between us grew smaller, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with danger. He would watch me work, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to commit every detail of me to memory. Sometimes, late at night when we were the only two left awake in the silent mansion, he would talk. Not about business, but about art, about history, about the bonsai trees in the garden he tended to with a surgeon's precision. He showed me glimpses of the man beneath the monster, and I found myself wanting to see more. One evening, one of his lieutenants, a grim-faced man named Ishida, brought in a captured soldier from the Sato clan. They took him to the basement. I tried to ignore it, to retreat into the world of ledgers and schedules, but the house felt suffocating, the air thick with impending violence. Hours later, Rio emerged, his face like a thundercloud. "He won't talk," he bit out, pacing the study. "He knows where Sato is holding Akiko, but he's loyal. Or stupid." Akiko. They hadn't killed her. They were using her as leverage, a pawn in their game. "What did he look like?" I asked quietly. Rio stopped pacing and looked at me. "What does it matter? When Mr. Sato would visit, before, this man was with him. As his driver. He was always nervous. He had a habit of rubbing a silver lighter in his pocket. Even though he didn't smoke, I remembered small details. The way he avoided eye contact. The way his gaze would always drift to the expensive art on the walls, a mixture of awe and resentment in his eyes. He doesn't want to be a soldier. He wants to be a boss." I walked over to Rio. "Let me talk to him." "Absolutely not," he said, his voice final. "You're trying to break him with force," I argued, my voice gaining strength. "But he's not afraid of pain. He's afraid of being nothing. Let me offer him something else." He stared at me, a war raging in his eyes. To allow me into that part of his world was to cross a line, to admit I was part of it. Finally, he gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The basement was cold and damp. The man was tied to a chair, his face bruised, but his eyes were defiant. Rio and Ishida stood in the shadows. I walked forward, holding a glass of water. I didn't offer it to him. I set it on a small table, just out of his reach. I didn't ask him questions. I talked about his lighter, about the watches Sato wore, about the difference between men who earned their power and those who simply inherited it. I painted a picture of a future for him, one where he wasn't a driver, but a man of respect. A future he could have in exchange for one piece of information. I wasn't threatening him. I was tempting him. I was using his ambition, his greed, the very weakness I had observed as a weapon. And it worked. He broke. He told us everything. When we were back in the study, the door closed, the adrenaline began to fade, and I felt a wave of nausea. I had just manipulated a man, played on his weaknesses to send Rio's soldiers to a location where men would surely die. I had crossed a moral line I could never uncross. I was no longer just a witness. I was a participant. Rio came to stand in front of me. He reached out and tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his eyes. "You did what was necessary," he said, his voice soft. "You saw the path to victory that I could not. You are formidable." The way he said it, the dark admiration in his eyes, felt more intimate than a kiss. This was our world now. This was our language. I told myself staying here was about survival. I whispered, the confession tumbling out of me before I could stop it. The truth was too heavy to hold alone anymore. I was lying to myself. "Were you?" he asked, his thumb gently stroking my jaw. "Or did you simply recognize where you belonged?" That was the moment the enemy made it personal. The raid on the warehouse was successful. Rio's men crippled the Sato clan's operations, but Sato himself escaped. And he was vengeful. The next day, a package arrived for me. Not for Rio.
For me.
Inside was a single, dead gardenia, my mother's favorite flower, and a photograph of the front of her house in Atlanta. The floor dropped out from under me. They knew who I was.
They knew where my family lived.
The threat was no longer just to me but to everything I had left behind. I stared at the photo, my blood turning to ice. Rio came into the room and saw my face. He saw the box. His expression, which was usually a mask of cold control, shattered into pure, murderous rage. He took the photo from my trembling hands, and the paper crumpled in his fist. He made a single phone call, his Japanese too fast and guttural for me to follow completely, but I understood the intent. It was the sound of a king unleashing his armies. When he hung up, he turned to me. The rage was gone, replaced by a chilling calm. "They will never touch them," he said. It was not a promise. It was a statement of absolute fact. "I am sending my best men. Your mother will think she has won the lottery and hired a new gardening service. They will be safe." He then took my face in his hands, his grip firm, grounding me. "But you're not safe here anymore." Not until Sato is gone, he looked at me, and I saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his tactical mind and something else, something deeper. "He is targeting you because he knows," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He knows you are not my assistant. He knows you are my weakness." And there it was, the word he feared above all others, the one that had cost him everything once before. But this time, the way he said it was different. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession. The final confrontation was not something Rio wanted me involved in. He had a plan, a precise surgical strike to eliminate Sato at a neutral meeting spot. He wanted me locked in the mansion, surrounded by guards. I refused. "I'm the reason he's coming out of hiding," I said, standing before him in his study as he checked his weapon. "He thinks he's luring you into a trap using me as bait. But he doesn't know that I was there when he met with Akiko. I was the one who served them tea. I heard him tell her about his escape route if things went bad. A service tunnel beneath the restaurant." He was boasting. Rio stopped what he was doing and stared at me. "You have been holding this information?" "I have been holding it for the right moment." I corrected him. "He won't expect me to be there. He won't expect me to be anything but a victim. He won't be looking at me. He'll be looking at you. I would be the diversion. The one thing Sato's arrogance wouldn't allow him to see as a threat." Rio's face was a hard mask of refusal, but he saw the logic in my argument. He saw the truth. I was no longer a pawn. I was a player. Reluctantly, he agreed. The restaurant was a high-end establishment in Ginza, all dark wood and hushed tones. I wore a simple black dress and a string of pearls Rio had given me, a piece of the gilded cage. I sat at the table across from him, playing the part of the terrified mistress. Sato arrived with his men, his smile wide and triumphant. He thought he had won. The conversation was tense, a verbal dance of threats and insults. Rio was magnificent, a study in controlled power, drawing all of Sato's attention, all of his hatred. As they spoke, I excused myself, my movements calm and deliberate. No one paid me any mind. I was just the woman, the prize. I found the service corridor, just as I remembered from my days of navigating the back-of-house areas in places like this. I located the entrance to the tunnel. It was hidden behind a stack of linen carts. I didn't have a weapon. I had a key I'd taken from the restaurant manager's office, using a simple lie about a lost earring. I unlocked the emergency access gate at the far end of the tunnel, the one that led out to the street where Rio's men were waiting. Then I returned to the corridor and simply waited. The signal was a shattered water glass back in the main room. Gunfire erupted. I heard shouts, the chaos of a plan falling apart. Sato's men were better prepared than we'd anticipated. A moment later, Sato himself burst into the service corridor, dragging a wounded Rio with him, a gun to his head. The tunnel. Sato snarled at one of his men.
Now.
He saw me standing there and laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Look at this. Your woman came to watch you die. Rio's eyes met mine over Sato's shoulder. There was no fear in them, only a silent, desperate command for me to run. I did not run. I looked past Sato, down the corridor, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Sato's man fumbled with the tunnel entrance. But as he pulled the door open, he was met not with an escape route, but with two of Rio's best soldiers. They opened fire. Sato's man fell. In that split second of shock, Rio moved. He slammed his head back into Sato's face, a brutal, bone-crunching impact. Sato staggered, his grip loosening. It was the opening Rio needed. But Sato was fast, recovering, raising his weapon again. He never got the chance. While his attention was on Rio, I had moved. I grabbed a heavy, industrial fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with all my might into the back of his knees. He screamed and crumpled, his leg buckling at an unnatural angle. The gun clattered to the floor. Rio was on him in an instant. The end was swift, brutal, and silent. I saved him. Not with a gun, but with my mind, my observation, my refusal to be a passive victim. Back in the silent mansion, the war was over. The doctor had stitched the wound in Rio's side where a bullet had grazed him. We stood in the study, the first light of dawn painting the Tokyo skyline in shades of gray and rose. The cost had been paid. Men were dead. Akiko, I learned, had been put on a plane with a new identity and a warning never to return to Japan, her family's influence shattered. She was exiled, a ghost. A reminder of the price of betrayal in this world. Rio walked to stand beside me at the massive window. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat of him, a comforting, solid presence in the quiet room. My father built this organization on loyalty and stone, he said, his voice low, his eyes on the sprawling city that was his kingdom. He believed any emotion was a flaw in the foundation. He turned his head, his dark eyes finally meeting mine. The mask was gone. There was no boss, no monster. Just the man. You are the only part of this empire that feels real. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more. An acknowledgement. A truth. He saw me, and in his world, to be truly seen was everything. He didn't ask me what I wanted or where I would go. He knew the choice was no longer his to make. It was mine. The world outside that window was vast. I could walk out the door and disappear, try to find my way back to the ordinary life I'd once known. Or I could stay here, in this beautiful, dangerous cage, with the man who had become its sole occupant with me. He watched me, waiting. The silence between us was not empty. It was filled with everything we had survived, everything we had become to one another. I turned away from the window, away from the dawn, and the world outside. I turned and faced him, and in the quiet certainty of that one, simple movement, he had his answer.